In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, leaving parliament paralyzed. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made him chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag burned down. Hitler accused the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used them to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. In 1931, without even informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital Mukden and then overran the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet ruler. Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been at its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first great test. Japan was universally condemned. But her response was blunt.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it didn't care. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, the Japanese signed a pact with Hitler. The aim was to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia were it to move on China. Then in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and invaded. It is easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All that, by 1928, his position seemed secure. Parliament was appointed rather than elected, and all power was firmly in the hands of the fascist Grand Council. Italy's armed forces were built up, including an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini launched a powerful navy, bigger than the combined might of the British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression came, Italy seemed to weather it better than most. Mussolini became a source of worldwide inspiration. Political leaders, not least Adolf Hitler in Germany, saw the fascist system as a role model, strong and purposeful, in contrast to the weakness of the democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini wanted more than adulation. He wanted to recreate the Roman Empire. And he already had a target in mind for his first imperial land grab. His target was Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. Italy already had colonies on its borders in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. It harried the Abyssinians, on occasions dropping gas bombs, even though gas had been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun. The Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands. It did impose economic sanctions, but they had little effect. Mussolini's aggression had revealed two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, was impotent. And both Europe's supposed major powers, the democracies Britain and France, no longer had the stomach for a fight. Rhineland and Saarland. But now he had a grander target in mind: his homeland. In the summer of 1938, he turned on his next prey, Czechoslovakia. A substantial German minority lived in the northwest of the country, an area known as the Sudetenland. So, on October the 1st, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and seized the Czech frontier fortifications. Hitler now began sizing up his next target, Poland. On August the 23rd, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, who everyone had believed were sworn enemies, announced a non-aggression. The agreement secretly specified that Poland would be split between the two countries, and Stalin would have a free hand to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. During the afternoon of August the 31st, 1939, German forces made their final preparations for the invasion of Poland. From the start, it went well for the Germans. The Polish Air Force was effectively eliminated within the first 2 days. On September the 27th, Warsaw surrendered. The next day, the victors carved Poland up according to the Nazi-Soviet pact. The Blitzkrieg against Poland had been a stunning success for Adolf Hitler. He had subdued an entire country in less than 4 weeks. On November the 30th, 1939, a new theater of war was opened up. The Soviet Union invaded its tiny neighbor, Finland. In the winter months, the only way it could get to Germany was via the Norwegian port of Narvik. If the Allies landed in Norway, this vital supply could be cut off. So he ordered plans to be prepared for an invasion of Norway. Denmark, which was in the way, would also have to be seized. The Norwegian defenders were swiftly overwhelmed, as were the Danes. German forces occupied their country within 24 hours. At dawn, a whole German airborne division parachuted into Holland to seize bridges and airfields. Simultaneously, the massive Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael was assaulted. On May the 14th, the Germans demanded the surrender of the port of Rotterdam. A large force of bombers took off as the Dutch hesitated. While they were airborne, the Dutch agreed to surrender the city, but apparently a recall message never reached the bombers. Rotterdam was devastated. The Dutch capitulated the next day. At 4 in the morning of June the 5th, a short bombardment began the final destruction of France. Assault troops crossed the Somme and the Aisne. At first, the French resistance was fierce, and the Germans struggled to break out of their bridgeheads. But, once again, the Luftwaffe helped crush the defenses. Soon the panzers were pushing south, and the trickle of surrendering French troops turned into a flood. On the 14th, the German army marched into Paris. The swastika was raised on the Eiffel Tower. Hitler had secured the prize which had eluded the Kaiser in 1914. As a French delegation entered the carriage, he handed them his terms and then left. The French insisted on consulting their government, but the next day they were told that if they didn't sign immediately, the panzers would roll again. They signed, and the humiliation of France was complete. For Hitler, his control of Western Europe seemed absolute. He felt sure that Britain must now seek peace, and that soon he could turn to the next stage of his master plan. Britain's situation seemed hopeless, and Hitler had no doubt that Britain would soon try to negotiate a peace. But Churchill quickly showed how determined he was prepared to be in the war against the Nazis. Goering selected August the 13th as Adlertag, Eagle Day, for the start of his main assault. His aim was to destroy RAF fighters in the air and the RAF's airfields and Britain's aircraft factories. One station on the Isle of Wight was put out of action, and several were damaged, but these were working again within hours. Goering did not believe that radar had a significant role to play in the battle, and so these attacks were not repeated. It was a big mistake. The Battle of Britain did not really end, it died away. Hitler now tried a new tactic. But for Hitler, this was no more than an irritating setback. Britain, he was convinced, could never be a serious threat. So he now turned to Eastern Europe. For Britain, there was now a chance to rebuild with a view one day to taking the fight to the enemy. But to do that, Churchill would need help. And there was only one country that could provide it: the United States. It would supply Britain with 50 World War I destroyers in return for 99-year leases on bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. In January 1941, Roosevelt introduced his so-called Lend-Lease Bill. The United States would supply weapons and war material to Britain and China, which was still struggling desperately against the invading Japanese. Payment would be delayed. The US Navy also began providing limited convoy escorts, particularly for US ships carrying Lend-Lease materials. Hitler now gave his submariners strict instructions not to sink American ships, as he didn't want to provoke the United States into war. He referred to Bletchley's output as his ultra-secret information, and ultra became its code name. The need to keep the source of the intelligence secret was so great that Churchill insisted that no action could be taken on the basis of ultra material unless a cover plan had been developed to convince the Germans that the intelligence must have come from another. The British aircraft carrier Glorious was covering the convoys withdrawing Allied troops from Norway when Bletchley decoded signals showing the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were approaching its position. A warning was passed to Royal Navy headquarters, but unaware of how accurate the information was likely to be, this chose not to pass it on. The Glorious was intercepted and sunk. The British Navy had learned the hard way just how important the new source of intelligence could be. It was not a mistake it would make again. On March the 4th, 1941, 2 commando units and a demolition squad were landed on the Lofoten Islands off northern Norway. Their main objective was to destroy. The commandos then rounded up 60 Norwegian collaborators and 225 German prisoners before returning without any losses. Churchill needed other ways to hurt them, so he focused on the resistance movements in the occupied countries. Its objectives were to encourage sabotage of the enemy war effort, gather intelligence, and prepare clandestine forces to disrupt German defenses.